Everyone, today's lesson is on liberalism. We're going to be learning about the key thinkers that you have to know as prescribed by Edexcel. Now, there are lots of liberal thinkers, but Edexcel has specifically picked 5 that you have to know for the exam. Here's their faces: Locke, Wollstonecraft, Mill, Rawls and Friedan. Now, some of these, particularly Wollstonecraft and Friedan, you might think, are they really liberals? You might disagree, you might be confused, but these are the ones that Edexcel say you have to know. I've put here you must refer to at least 2 of these thinkers in any liberalism essay. If you don't refer to 2 of these 5, your mark is capped at level 2. So it's really important that you refer to 2 of their names. You're going to read about some other liberal thinkers from the textbook and the revision guide and things like that, but these are the 5 core thinkers. So even if you refer to another thinker, another liberal, it doesn't replace one of these 5. So you can have 2 of these plus any extras, but if you have 1 of these and extras, it doesn't count, which sounds really silly, I know, but this is how Edexcel have designed the course. So the other thing to note is that you can't just name drop these people. You have to actually show some knowledge of them. And then I know that sounds really obvious, but there is the temptation to write an essay and then just throw in a random name just to cover that base, and that won't wash with the exam board. So it's really important that you've got a good grasp of who said what, so that you can go above level 2 in your essays. So we're going to start with the first thinker, John Locke. So at the top there, where I've written his name, there is a hyperlink to a really good video. These videos are really detailed. So all I've done here is just given you some questions to answer in relation to that video, because there is some information in there that gives you a lot of context about Locke, but isn't necessarily essential for your essays. So these questions are designed to narrow down exactly what you need from the video. There are other videos about Locke. There are loads of videos about all of these thinkers. Please stick to the ones that I show you, because some of the videos, like every topic in politics, are on YouTube and they're wrong. So it's important that you just follow the ones that I've highlighted. I mean, do feel free to do additional research, but do take what is said with a pinch of salt. If something doesn't ring true or doesn't marry up with what we've learnt in class, the likelihood is that it's not correct. So have a go at doing that. I'm just going to run through some of the key ideas as well in relation to Locke. So firstly, Locke rejected the view that kings and queens had the divine right to rule, and he believed that the state should be created by mankind to serve mankind based on consent from mankind. So consent, if you think about in our modern day society, we give consent for our representatives to represent us in Parliament. So consent is really, gaining that permission from the people to rule on their behalf. So this idea of the divine right of kings was rejected by liberals, as you know from the first PowerPoint, because they started to believe in rationality and science, and this abandonment of religion started to emerge. So it didn't make sense to still subscribe to this view that God had given certain people the right to rule over others. He believed that the state of nature was based on rationality. So just to be clear, the state of nature is a time where, or a time before we had, say, a government, a state, as we formally know it today. So he was saying that before we had these specific rules of government to rule over us, we, were all free citizens. We all had this sort of natural state where it was underpinned by natural laws, natural rights. And individuals generally tolerated this state of nature because of these natural laws and rights. And generally, people were tolerant of each other and were able to get along. What Locke is saying is that any state that's emerged since then, so any government that's emerged since then, should respect these natural rights and they shouldn't violate them. And any kind of government that emerges has to uphold the natural rights that we had before in the state of nature, and if they are violated, then why would we even want that type of government to emerge? We would reject them. We would perhaps withdraw our consent from that institution. So his ideal state is one where people voluntarily consent. So we're thinking about voting, not one where we give consent but we're forced to. because that wouldn't be genuine consent. So they voluntarily give consent to accept the state's rules in return for an improved situation. So as I said before, if it leads to anything that was worse than what was in the state of nature, our consent would be withdrawn. So this later became known as social contract theory. We don't study Rousseau, but Rousseau is another thinker that you might want to research who also talks about the social contract. Later we'll look at Hobbes. Sometimes Hobbes is described as a social contract theorist too, but we'll do him when we do conservatism. And actually Locke responds to and discuss, they kind of debate what the state of nature is generally like. So Hobbes believed the state of nature to be nasty, brutish and short, and actually in a state of nature we'd all fight each other because there are no structures to kind of regulate our behaviour, whereas Locke actually thinks we're perhaps more tolerant and respectful of each other. So Locke is essentially suggesting a limited, dispersed government is necessary to gain ongoing consent from the people. So ongoing consent means that obviously we can continuously need to give our consent. It's not like we give our consent for a government to rule over us and then suddenly we're in a situation where they're exercising too much power and we can't get rid of them. That's why it has to be ongoing. We have to, have regular elections, regular times where we can say who we would like to govern. This is, as I said, in case they overstep their power. So our second key thinker is Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft is a liberal feminist. I have to admit, when I first saw that Mary Wollstonecraft was in the spec for liberalism, I was a bit confused because really she falls mostly under feminism, but her ideas are rooted in liberal ideology. Partly, I imagine that Edexcel needed a token female in their liberal section of the specification, so they kind of just shoved her in there. But to be honest, she is rooted in liberalism, so I can see some justification. But I must say that students over the past few years have found it difficult to include her in essays. She is mostly associated with classical liberalism, and I'll explain why. So the basic liberal premise that human nature is guided by reason, she believed should be applied to all humans. So, other liberal thinkers said, human nature is based on rationality, but really they were talking about men. In 18th century England, women were portrayed as irrational creatures. And so that's why they weren't given the right to vote. That's why they weren't given equal access to education, because it was seen that they weren't able to be rational. So obviously Mary Wollstonecraft said, no, this is about human nature, and human nature is based on rationality, not mankind, but all humankind, I suppose. So she argued this because limiting women in this way was harmful for England, as it limits England's stock of intelligent beings. So it's preventing our country, she argued, from prospering. So really what you need is as many people as possible to be thinkers, to be moving reason and rationality forwards for progression. And that really was what the theme of the Enlightenment was. It was about trying to progress. So she was like, well, why would you cut your stock of intelligence in half by limiting it only to applying to men? She thought that women were complicit in this subjugation. So women were actually partly responsible for why they were treated this way. And she said this is because women generally desired marriage and children only. They didn't really have any ambitions for education, for work, for thinking, etc. So she said that the reason for this was because women were not educated. And if that they were educated, they would also become enlightened beings. So she said that women should have equal access to education so their individual potential could be fully realised. So she is associated with classical liberalism. That's where you might use her in an essay. And if you had an essay on human nature specifically, she would be a useful person to use there. Okay, J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, he is the third thinker. J.S. Mill was the first political theorist I've ever read about. In year 12, I read his book on liberty. And I would say he's quite an accessible thinker to read. If you want to start reading original texts, then you might want to start with Mill because his work is quite accessible. It's not too difficult. Some of the other thinkers that we're going to learn about, particularly Hobbes. Hobbes writes in Old English, and it's quite confusing and convoluted. Anyone who does philosophy can tell you as well that philosophers tend to be quite long-winded in the way that they write. But as I said, J.S. Mill's work on liberty is quite useful and accessible. If you're thinking of doing philosophy or politics at university, this is the time to really start reading original texts from key thinkers. It looks really impressive in a UCAS form. I wrote about Mill in my UCAS application, and it gives you something to talk about with admissions tutors as well. So firstly, we've got some key terms here, harm principles. So a lot of these key terms, hopefully you covered when you did some of the pre-tutored videos, but just to go over them, remind ourselves, the harm principle is the idea that individuals should be free to do anything except harm other individuals. Now, this raises some issues. Obviously, how do we define harm? How much freedom should someone be given? And we'll look at that in a bit more later. Tyranny of the majority we covered when we did component 2 anyway, but Mill essentially was talking about the concern that government by consent would be compromised if the wishes of some individuals were overtaken by the wishes of the majority. So, if you've got a minority of individuals that believe one thing and the majority that believe the other, the majority will always win. And sometimes that can be dangerous, especially if you're thinking about minority groups like LGBT community, or if you're thinking about ethnic minorities. If their wishes are not heard, it can actually lead to a violation of their rights. So he was worried about this concept. He believed in developmental individualism. So this is where each person should make decisions that develop themselves to their fullest extent. However, in developing himself, he cannot harm or stop their development. So, I might seek to develop myself and flourish, but I must make sure that I'm not doing it at the expense of somebody else. Again, that's a really tricky thing to define. How about if I'm, perhaps accumulating wealth, if I'm exploiting somebody else through labour, perhaps I'm, paying the minimum wage or something, that could be seen as exploitation of their development. So it is a difficult one to define. The other two key terms are in relation to tolerance. So self-regarding human action is actions that do not impinge on the freedom of others. So my personal views, my personal religious views, for example, that doesn't necessarily affect anybody else. If I believe in God, it doesn't affect your life. So it's a self-regarding action. Other regarding action then is when my actions could harm the freedom of others, and it shouldn't be tolerated. So if I start, beating someone up or having a riot, that's obviously going to harm other people. So it shouldn't be tolerated and it should be stopped. So he's seen as a bridge between classical and modern liberalism. He doesn't fit neatly into either category. In his book on liberty, he writes about negative freedom and the harm principle, which we've looked at before. So remember, negative freedom is when you're able to do whatever you please. Even if you are harming yourself, I might have the freedom to smoke and drink as much as I like. That is a form of negative freedom. I am actually harming myself by doing those things. But in his book, on liberty, he believes that negative freedom is important. But he qualifies this by talking about the harm principle, that I should be free to do as I please, as long as I don't harm somebody else. Self-regarding and other regarding action was used to clarify the concept of tolerance, because the word tolerance means you perhaps don't agree with somebody, but you accept that they have different opinions or different ideas to you, and you allow them to have those beliefs. So the tolerance of diverse opinions was especially important to Mill because it would ensure new ideas emerged, but bad ideas were exposed via open, rational debate. So this is up for debate as well, because what is he talking about here? Because imagine if I was, say, giving racist opinions, I had racist viewpoints. Obviously, that is quite harmful to other people. So should we tolerate those kinds of views? Obviously, in our modern day society, we say no. But in J.S. Mill's view, well, if that's a bad idea, hopefully if a bad idea such as a racist viewpoint would be exposed and be debated and be quashed and would be gotten rid of. But we know that that doesn't necessarily happen. And that's where his idea of the tyranny of the majority comes into play. He's different to previous thinkers because he did not see liberty as a natural right based on our human nature. He believed that liberty is an engine of ongoing human development. So liberty is something that we can use to become better people. So he believed human nature wasn't fixed. So classical liberals believed our human nature is very fixed and is based on this idea that we have these natural rights, liberties, and that we will tolerate each other. But he believes that actually our human nature is always improving and we need liberty to continuously improve and flourish. He actually uses this quote: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." And this quote has been interpreted in many different ways. If you Google it, you'll get lots of different answers as to what it actually means. People have written, their dissertations on this quote alone. But in regards to what we're talking about here, we can base it on his ideas of developmental individualism. It's better to be a human being constantly trying to improve and develop and never ever be a finished product or a finished article, never be perfect, than to be a lowly creature like a pig that is satisfied with the very basics, feeding, eating, sleeping, etc. Because actually it's important to continuously develop. That's what being a human being is all about, in his view. So our fourth thinker is John Rawls. Again, I found a really good clip. I think it's by the same people. I have given you some questions, so just click on the clip and try and answer those. In summary of John Rawls, he is a modern liberal thinker, and he believed in foundational equality. So he thought it wasn't enough to have formal equality where we're all equal in the eyes of the law and we're protected by the law. He believed in the need for a greater social and economic equality. So he thought that actually we should, for economic equality, we should, raise more taxes and redistribute wealth more thoroughly between the rich and the poor. You might think, well, why does he believe that? That sounds like a socialist idea or a communist idea or something like that. But actually, he falls short of being a socialist, and we'll look at that in a minute. In order to justify this view of foundational equality, he advocated that we should do a test. So it's a thought experiment where you place yourself in the shoes of someone else and you consider whether their experience of life is fair. So he calls this the veil of ignorance test. So I might imagine myself to be a impoverished child living in really poor conditions, and I would think, well, would I be happy in this situation? Would I consider this situation to be fair? I might consider myself as another minority group, and if you can't answer the question, yes, I would definitely be happy with this situation and it would be fair, then actually that means that society needs to be reformed. And he thinks that if you're a rational being and if you're an empathetic being, you would choose a society where the poorest and those in minority groups are supported, and that their life should be better than their current situation. And you need to reimagine society so that it actually supports those people. So therefore, that's why his view of more tax, a larger welfare state, etc., redistribution is justified, because actually, if anyone put themselves in the shoes of that person, they would consent to receiving more help from others. So therefore, it's justified to have this enlarged state, not the night watchman state that classical liberals advocate. However, he does not believe in equality of outcome, and this is where he isn't really a socialist, because some people immediately think he is because of this belief in a larger welfare state. He still believes that there should be scope for individual liberty and self-fulfillment. So he doesn't care if there's a big gap between the very richest and the poorest. Like if you've got people that are multi-billionaires and then you've got poor people, he said that's fine as long as the poorest are supported and the poorest, have the basic essentials. And, if we were to put ourselves in their position, that we would see it as fair and justified. If you think about if everybody had, equality in terms of outcome, we all had the same wealth, property, etc., then where would there be any kind of drive for flourishment? Why would I feel the need to go and educate myself or get a better job or, flourish? There would be no sort of drive for me to do that. So that's why he thinks that there should still be this gap, because it leads to human flourishment and self-fulfillment. Okay, Betty Friedan. Now, Betty Friedan, I'm not going to spend much time on her because, again, she basically is the modern version of Wollstonecraft. She develops Wollstonecraft's ideas a bit further and talks about cultural conditioning. So cultural conditioning is how we're raised, the norms and values that we're taught as children, how our society perceives women. And she talks about how cultural conditioning needs to change in order for women to be seen as rational creatures and ensure that they have equality of opportunity. So if you log into the Pearson textbook on page 119, you'll see some information about her. And I'm going to send you page 36 of the small Hodder textbook that you'll receive when we get back to school, so that you can answer these questions. Shouldn't take you too long. Here is just a summary of the key themes. So the themes are human nature, the state, society, and the economy. You could be asked a question on all of these or just one of these. So you might get a question, to what extent do liberals agree on human nature? So if we're talking about human nature in our essay, we would compare what these thinkers say about human nature. So I might say that they mostly agree. So you might talk about how Locke and Wollstonecraft, both being classical liberals, agree on their views on human nature. But actually, human nature between Rawls and Locke is differing, okay? And how Rawls thinks human nature is ongoing and is not fixed and is continuously developing, whereas Locke thinks human nature is a fixed idea, that we're rational and our human nature is based on natural rights. So, it's important that you might want to save this somewhere. You might want to highlight it because it will be useful when we come to do our essays. So all I would like you to do, please, is based on everything we've done on liberalism so far, is look at this question: has modern liberalism abandoned the principles of classical liberalism? So essentially it's saying, what are the similarities and differences? If you're saying yes, modern liberalism has abandoned the principles of classical liberalism, you want to say how they're different from one another. And no is obviously how they are the same, and how modern liberalism is a continuation of classical liberalism. So what I'd like you to do is try and give at least 2 points on each side, and I'd like you to include key thinkers as well in your charts. This will help us because the next thing we're going to do is look at a specific exam question. For this topic, they're 24 marks, and I'll guide you through how you would answer one of those. Great, so that's all we're doing today. Good luck with watching those videos and taking some notes. If you could please send me your answers to that final slide, this one, by Friday, that would be great. Take care, thanks, bye.